right. Well, welcome everyone to the McFarland Public Library. My name is Sarah and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here. And I have the honor to introduce Ron Larson. For those of you who don't know, he's quite the historian for everything McFarland. So I'm delighted to hear some new stories, different from the ones we heard this past summer. Ron, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your interest in what I have to say. Today we're going to talk about the mystery of McFarland place names. And so we're going to be traveling down some McFarland streets, and we're going to be going by and visiting some McFarland parks and conservancies, and we'll be stopping off at some buildings. It's kind of like a virtual walking tour that we're going to take today. And as we're going around McFarland, the most obvious things that you see are the waterways here, because we're so lucky to be in a community that's next to a beautiful lake, Lake Wabisa, and then the Yahara River stretches on our southern border and includes Lower Mud Lake. And so the interesting thing is how did these bodies of water get their names? And now, these lakes have been around for 12,000 years, ever since the last ice age. And as the glacier retreated, it was gouging out the low spots in the area, and the water filled in, and the Yahara River connected them all. And so as the glacier receded, new vegetation sprouted up, and as the new vegetation came, the animals followed and took interest in the vegetation, and then people followed the animals as they hunted them. And so 12,000 years ago, the first people were here, and they saw the 4 lakes. And they obviously had names for them, but we don't know what the Paleo Indians called them. But as time went on and cultures and people changed, we had the early woodland and the late woodland and the mound builders, and then eventually the Ho-Chunk. And so the Ho-Chunk called this area the 4 Lakes as well. We call it the 4 Lakes area, and as well as did the Ho-Chunk. And their name for the 4 Lakes was Dejo. And so you might be familiar with the word Dejo if you're a gambler. Out on the interstate is the Ho-Chunk Casino named Dejo, and it's the 4 Lakes. But in 1829 and 1832, the American government came in, and they were moving westward. So they made treaties with the Indians of Wisconsin, and some were physically removed. But after the war of the Black Hawk War, surveyors from the U.S. government started coming in and taking a look at this area. And so they discovered in quotes, the 4 lakes. And as they came up from the south, they found out, there were 4 lakes in a row. So the first names that they called them were first, second, third, and fourth lakes. First lake being Kekansa, and Wabisa being the second lake, which hopefully you've all read the City of the Second Lake history of McFarland. So that's how it gets its name, because Wabisa was the second lake. And as time went on, people kept moving in, and Madison was settled, and Wisconsin became a territory in 1836, and eventually in 1848 we were a state. And the second governor of Wisconsin, Leonard Farwell, thought that the lakes should have official names. And he recruited the help of Lyman Draper, who was the first director of the Wisconsin Historical Society, to come up with some names for the lakes. And Leonard Farwell thought they should have Native American names. And so Lyman Draper came up with Wabisa for the second lake. And that's an Ojibwa name, meaning swan. And so Leonard Farwell officially named the 4 lakes, and he passed it on to the legislature. And on Valentine's Day 170 years ago, the four lakes became official, the names of the four lakes, Mendota, Monona, Waubesa, and Kegonsa, as the legislature passed the bill on February 14th. And but what were the original names of the Ho-Chunk, who were the people that lived here? And so the Ho-Chunk called it Sahuchitela, meaning the Lake of the Rushes. But the Ojibwa word was Wabisi, meaning swan, and that's the one that was chosen for the official name of the second lake. And Yahira is a Ho-Chunk word as well, but it means catfish river. And the Ojibwa also had a word for the river, which meant catfish. And for the first, the last half of the 19th century, people called this river Catfish or Yahira. It went back and forth. It wasn't official until 1903, when the U.S. Board of Geographic Names issued a declaration clarifying all the records, saying that this is the Yahira River. And then there's Mud Lake. All the beautiful names that we have for bodies of water in McFarland area, we have Mud Lake. But this is Lower Mud Lake, so that's special. And we also have Upper Mud Lake, as you know. But Upper Mud Lake was kind of man-made in a way when the railroad came through in 1854, and they made the trestle across, and they filled in across. So they cut off the northern portion of Lake Waubesa, and over time they just named it Upper Mud Lake. But Lower Mud Lake is a very special place in McFarland, just because of what it does with the marshes and a great flyway for migratory birds. But it's not muddy, and so I don't know why the name Mud Lake, but I guess it's a natural name for a body of water that's shallow, and then it has lake peat at the bottom of the lake, and it's decomposed organisms and algae and plankton. So it's a very healthy thing, but it's a very common name for lakes. There are 897 lakes in the United States named Mud Lake. And in Wisconsin, there are 116 mud lakes, making it the most common lake name in the state. And there are actually 4 mud lakes in Dane County. So you think maybe we could come up with a better name for that special spot. So if you want to start a petition for a changing the name, that would be fine. The earliest mention of Mud Lake that I found was in 1861. It was actually in a Dane County plat map. So the name goes way back. And so as things developed, Wisconsin became a state in 1848, and more settlers were coming in, and the railroad came through and connected Milwaukee to Madison in 1854. But there was no McFarland at that time. But William McFarland worked for the railroad, the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, and he started in 1850, and it took them 4 years to get to Madison with the railroad, and then they were going to push further west to Paradishe into the Mississippi. And William McFarland was at that time a construction foreman on the railroad, so he was away from home a lot. He lived in Milwaukee, and he finally had enough of that type of work, so he told the railroad that he was quitting. But he must have been a good employee, because the railroad asked him to stay on, and they had an idea that he should buy 160 acres of land in Section 3 of the town of Dunn, the northeast section of the town of Dunn. And if he did that, they wanted him to put up a depot, so they'd have a depot between Stoughton and McFarland. And the key was, and you could name, they told him you could name the depot after yourself, and you could make this town and name it after yourself. And so William McFarland thought that was a splendid idea. So he did. He bought the land and built the depot, and he named it McFarland. And that's how we have our name, McFarland. There's a long history of William McFarland, but I won't get into it for time's sake. But if you want to know more about McFarland, you can go to McFarland YouTube channel. And I did a presentation last year on the railroad, and I did more information on William McFarland at that time. And so he proceeded to have the town plotted out. He signed the papers buying the land in July of 1856, and by that fall, he had hired somebody to plot out the community. And you see some familiar streets here, and you see some that you've never heard of. And so William McFarland had some grandiose plans for his community. He wanted it to be, every bit of that 160 acres to be filled in with streets and lots. And so you can see here, Main Street that comes across the tracks and meets Exchange Street. We all know about that. And Broadhead Street and Huff Street, Anthony Street. And one interesting thing is Long Street, and it goes all the way parallel to the tracks. And that's why it's called Long Street, because it was the longest street on his map. But as you can see here, also on the opposite side, parallel to the southern and western part of the tracks is Bashford Street. And it was meant to go all the way up on one side of the tracks, just like Long Street. But for some reason, that never happened. And as you know, Bashford Street is just this tiny one-block street. But so this was the plan. And for our Stoughton friends in the audience, I just want to point out, once upon a time, there was a Stoughton Street. It was just a little tiny block, but it's basically Milwaukee Street now as it comes across and crosses the tracks. For some reason, Stoughton didn't stick as a name. But to have that platted out, William McFarland had to hire a surveyor, and William Huff was the Dane County surveyor at the time. And so William Huff came out in the fall of 1856 and plotted out the land. And so there's a Huff Street in McFarland, in the older part of downtown. And I'm guessing that William McFarland thought of naming the street after the surveyor. I don't think William Huff named it after himself. But William Huff was a upstanding citizen, and he was hired out by William McFarland, as I said, but he died 1 year after he laid out the McFarland map. And in the State Journal, there's an article that mentioned his death, and it says, even though he had been in Dane County for only 5 years, he was well thought of. Upon his death, a notice appeared in the Wisconsin State Journal stating Huff was a man of intelligence and literary taste, of accurate and energetic business habits, and had become widely known and highly esteemed by the people of Dane County. So William Huff was very well thought of, even though at one time in 1966, someone who lived in McFarland didn't think highly of the street or the name, and they petitioned the village to change the name to something else. I don't know why they wanted to, because they didn't know how to pronounce it. It's H-O-U-G-H. It's kind of tough, but it rhymes with Huff. But anyway, the request was made in '66, and it was denied. And so here's another look at the original plat map. For some reason, it just never filled in. And I think part of that is because it was plotted out in the fall of 1856. In 1857, there was a depression. There was the Panic of 1857, and that lasted for a couple of years. And then shortly after that, there was the Civil War, which lasted 4 years. And so the timing wasn't great for William McFarland to sell lots. But he sold most of them, and in this area, as you can see, the housing and a few houses down here on Lake Street. And why it's called Lake Street, I don't have a clue. That's one of the mysteries, because there's no lake near it. But it was just in this old area that people were buying lots for businesses or for their homes. But let's take a look at some of the streets that we know of and who they're named after. And so Farwell Street, that's one of the main thoroughfares in McFarland today. It's besides Highway 51, I would say, it's my guess that it's the busiest street in town, primarily because of the high school, and it's one of the main thoroughfares to get from the center of the old community and some of the housing developments out to 51. But as I mentioned, Leonard Farwell earlier, he was the second governor. He named the 4 lakes. But he was governor from 1852 to 1854. And he was a strong promoter of Madison and the Madison area. And that's one reason why he wanted to have the lakes be named, so people could identify with the lakes and maybe be interested in moving here. But he was very big on promoting Madison and the capital and whatnot. But for some reason, he only served 1 term. And eventually he made his way out to Washington, D.C. And he was the chief examiner in the U.S. Patent Office. And he was in Ford's Theater the night Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And so he's considered, Leonard Farwell is considered a hero because he feared that there was more than just one gunman out there. So he ran and warned the vice president, Andrew Johnson, that his life could be in danger. So they took precautions, and Andrew Johnson remained safe, even though there had been plans to assassinate him as well. So Leonard Farwell is said to have saved Andrew Johnson's life. And after his time in Washington, he moved to Chicago. And unfortunately, he lost most of his property and possessions in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And he moved after that to Missouri, where he lived out the rest of his life and died in 1889. So next time you're driving down Farwell Street, you can think of Leonard Farwell and being at Ford's Theater on that fateful night. And this is an interesting segment of Farwell Street. Early on, Farwell didn't go very far from the center of town. I think it just went out far enough to reach a couple farms. But then Highway 51 was built 1928, 1929. And so then Farwell may have been extended out there. But even before that, the resorts of Lake Wabisa around 1900, first couple decades, Farwell may have been extended to reach the resorts or the cabins and cottages. But it didn't go the same route that we know today. So if you take a look at this aerial shot, this is from 1956, 1957. Here's Farwell Street coming out, but then it turns where Burma Road starts and it goes out here. This is currently what today would be Burma Road. And so as you can see, it turns. This is where the high school is right now. And it curved. And here's a photo. The person taking the photo is standing in Indian Mountain Conservancy on Burma Road and looking north. And so here's Farwell Street coming down from, middle of McFarland, downtown, and it curves here. This is, again, where the high school is located now, and this is Burma Road today, but back then, Farwell turned and continued, and then turned again and went out to Highway 51. And here it says that it's taking out the kinks in the road by straightening Farwell. Farwell then in 1958 or 57, they made it go straight like the path that we know today. So it wasn't that long ago that Farwell Street curved onto Burma Road. And it wasn't called Burma Road until 1958 or 1959. And so, since we're talking about Burma Road, it was named by Charles Sanderson, whose photo on the right. He was born here, grew up in McFarland, and he started a nursery on what is now Burma Road, but he called the nursery Burma Road Garden, even though the street wasn't named Burma Road. He called it that himself because Burma Road is this, famous road in Burma, Southeast Asia, that was constructed in the 1936, 1937 to have a supply route to China because the Japanese had blocked off the Chinese seaports. And so they needed to get goods up to China. So they built this Burma Road, and it was a very twisty, rough, mountainous road. And if you go to, the road probably back in the 1940s, 1950s in McFarland, probably was gravel, had a lot of potholes, and had that one hill and the curves. And so Charles Sanderson thought it was just like Burma Road. Not quite, but in his mind. So he called it Burma Road, and the village accepted that as the name. And so when Farwell Street went straight to 51, they renamed that one portion Burma Road in 1958 or so. And this is Charles Sanderson looking very French as he's posing for the photograph under the Eiffel Tower in around 1960. But his nursery, they sold a lot of ornamental shrubbery. Now back to the original streets. Bashford Street, we mentioned that how in the original plot it went along parallel to the tracks all the way. But then for some reason that didn't happen, and it's just this one little block. But it's named after another governor, Coles Bashford. And he was the 5th governor of Wisconsin. And he came in after William Barstow, and William Barstow was the 3rd governor. And so you might be thinking, well, how does that make sense? Barstow was the 3rd and Bashford was the 5th. Who was the 4th? Well, that's an interesting story where Bashford ran against Barstow, who was the incumbent, and Barstow won by about 150 votes. And at that time, the lieutenant governor race was separate from the governors. They weren't paired together. And Arthur MacArthur was running as the lieutenant governor, and he won his race. And Barstow won, but Bashford contested it, saying there was voter fraud. So this voter fraud thing goes way back. It's not just recent history, but so Bashford is saying that there were some inconsistencies with the vote, and so it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court went with Bashford as the winner, and so Bashford was declared the winner, but Arthur MacArthur, being elected as lieutenant governor, thought he was next in line because he was succeeding Barstow, because he was Barstow's running mate. And so Arthur MacArthur went into the governor's office and wouldn't leave. And so Bashford was getting a little upset with Arthur MacArthur. And so he told MacArthur either leave peacefully or by force. And I'll call in the militia. And after 4 days, Arthur MacArthur left office and Bashford assumed his rightful place as governor. And but just a little side story about Arthur MacArthur. He was governor for 4 days, and he's officially listed as Wisconsin's 4th governor, even though it was just for 4 days. But Arthur MacArthur had a son, Arthur MacArthur Jr. And because of his dad's position, Arthur MacArthur Jr. really wanted to join the army and fight in the Civil War. And so he was allowed to go into the Union Army, and he went in as an officer at 16. But then at 18, he was down in Chattanooga fighting for the Union side, and General Grant was the commanding officer there, and there was this mountain Missionary Ridge that Grant wanted to take, and the rebels were up at the top, and Grant gave specific orders: do not go any further up the ridge until you hear from me. But the Wisconsin regiment was battling, and their flag bearer got shot, and the flag fell down. So another guy picked up the flag, and he got shot, and the flag fell down. But Arthur MacArthur Jr. picked up the flag and went charging up the ridge, screaming, "On Wisconsin, on Wisconsin!" And the Union troops in the Wisconsin regiment went charging up to the very top. And Grant's watching this from another vantage point, and he's saying, whoever that man is, if he fails, court-martial him. If he succeeds, give him a medal. And so he succeeded, and Arthur MacArthur Jr. got the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he stayed in the military for his career, and he was in the Spanish-American War and ended up in the Philippines, where after the Spanish-American War, he was named the temporary military governor of the Philippines. And then he had a son, Douglas MacArthur, who was also in the military, also got the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he was the one who, with the famous line, as he left the Philippines, "I shall return." So that's just a side story with Coles Bashford, but sorry about that. But getting back to Coles Bashford, he was involved in his own scandal as well. So these scandals go almost way back. But he took bribes, along with a lot of his people in his administration, from the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad. And he took cash and stock and bribes from the railroad. And he was smart enough to cash in his stocks before the railroad went bankrupt. So he came away with about $65,000. And that's a lot of money back in those days. And so there was a lot of uproar about this. So Coles Bashford knew he better not run for re-election. It wasn't going to be a good outcome. But he never went to court because somebody burned all the evidence. And so there was never any paper evidence. And so Bashford slipped out of the state, eventually ended up in the territory of Arizona, where he was elected to office down there. So it's a tiny street now, but it has a big story. And then another street, Taylor Road, where in the original plat map, was supposed to be Bashford Street. And I don't know if it's named after William Robert Taylor or not, but it made a good story, so I went with it. But I don't know. There in the original plat map, there's a very tiny railroad crossing, and it's Taylor Street, but it's Tailor. And so I don't know if that was a misprint or not. But just quickly, this guy's story, and you can understand why I might think it's him. He moved into the Cottage Grove area in the late 1840s and was elected to the Assembly in 1855. About the same time, William McFarland was in the area on the railroad, and then the year after he founded McFarland. But William Taylor went from the Assembly to the Senate in 1859, and he was elected governor in 1873. But I'm thinking that William McFarland maybe knew William Taylor because while governor, Taylor really was focused on controlling the railroads and making sure that they were honest and that railroad employees would get benefited if they got injured and whatnot. And he, it's known as the Potter Act, where he was, advocating for railroads to be more responsible. So I would think as a depot agent in McFarland, William McFarland would want something like that under law, as a law. And so he probably was very for William Taylor and his position. But we don't really know for sure. But sticking with a theme here, William Taylor was also investigated for wrongdoing. They charged him with misuse of public funds, and he lost heavily in the grain speculation. So things didn't end well for William Robert Taylor, and he had to go to a elderly shelter, the Gisholt Home for the Aged, where he died in relative obscurity. So we don't really know about Taylor Road. It's it's just one of the mysteries of McFarland place names. And this is another mystery of McFarland place names, Edward Broadhead and Broadhead Street, and you can see that they're spelled differently. So I'm quite sure Broadhead Street is named after Edward Broadhead, but Edward Broadhead was a construction engineer for the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad at the same time that William McFarland worked for the railroad as a construction foreman, so they knew each other. And William Broadhead was the president of the railroad in 1857. So there were a couple misspellings, I'm thinking, in the original plat map, and we've just continued the misspelling on our street signs to today. And I checked all the street signs, and they all are B-R-O-A-D. I thought at one time there were some in the older street signs that were spelled correctly, but on all the official maps, it's B-R-O-A-D, even though it's Edward Broadhead with B-R-O-D. And Broadhead, Wisconsin is named after Edward Broadhead. And Merrill Street, another street on the original plat map, and named after another railroad man. Just like William McFarland, Sherburne Merrill was a construction superintendent with or construction foreman with the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. And he started at the same time, 1850, same as William McFarland. So it's very likely that they knew each other. And from 1853 to 1857, Merrill worked as a conductor, paymaster, and assistant superintendent under Edward Broadhead. And then Merrill was superintendent of the Milwaukee and Watertown Railroad, and the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad, and the general manager of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, or what we used to call the Milwaukee Road. So several streets have a railroad connection of people that William McFarland knew. And here are some of the other original street names on the original plat map. Anthony, today we call it Anthony, but here's another difference in the spelling, A-N-T, there's no H, and it was just Anthony. So I don't know if that was a misprint on the map. We don't know who Anthony was. And Church Street and Cook Street, we know those streets today, but they didn't come into existence, even though they're in the plat map of 1856. They weren't constructed until the 1970s. But it's interesting that the village kept those names over the years and then put them on the official map. And Church Street, I don't know, I think William McFarland was just imagining there might be a church there someday, because in 1856 there weren't any churches. The first church in McFarland was 1867. So it's interesting to think that the village in the 1970s continued with that name. And the others, those were streets on the original plat map, and they continue today. And this is an aerial shot of McFarland in 1930. And so it really didn't change much from 1860. The same streets. But then there are some other streets added kind of on the outskirts of the original town. And one thing that's similar with all of those streets, of all those names, they were all farmers. And so the roads just went by or through their farms. And so the roads were named after each one. And Amy Road, named after Freeman Amy. And he was an early McFarland businessman with his brother Eugene. Eugene, well, there are several brothers, or 3 or 4 Amy brothers who came to the McFarland area around 1855, 1856. And they came from western New York, Dutchess County. And Eugene started the lumber yard in 1856. And Freeman left McFarland and went to Madison and then to Beaver Dam. But then he returned 3 years or 2 years later, and he took over the lumber yard in 1859 when Eugene went back to New York briefly to get married. And then when Eugene came back, he went into business and had a store and was the postmaster. But Freeman continued with the lumber yard until 1985 when he sold it. And then Freeman went into farming full time. And he had a farm at the end of Main Street. His farm was up here, and all the land was his farmland. And at this time, Amy Road was the northern limits, or was the boundary line between the town of Blooming Grove and the town of Dunn. And then it's over the years that McFarland annexed more land to the north into Blooming Grove. But that's where the Amy house sits. It's the big house at the end of Main Street there. And in 1910, Freeman Amy dies, and his son Robert takes over the farm. And Robert retires in 1942 from farming, even though the farm continues and is operated by tenant or renter farmers. And finally, the family sold it around 1959 to the McFarland Industrial Corporation. And then so the land, the Amy farmland, then was developed, and Main Street continued from here and it continued up to Marsh Road in the early 1960s. And Sigilco Road. That's a very long road starting over by Lake Obisa, and then it goes eastward all the way to 12 and 18. And this road has changed a great deal over the years, but it's named after Carl and Sophia Sigilco. And as you see the cow and with a slash through it, there are no cows in Sigilco. So it's a name that's widely mispronounced, but it's Sigilco. And they came from Germany, and as children, they each came over with their parents. And Carl inherited the acreage on Sigilco Road from his parents. And so he took over the farm. And then one of his sons, George, continued farming on that land. He had another son, Frank, who wasn't farming, but he lived in McFarland. He ran the livery stable for a while, and he lived in the big Queen Anne house with the turret down Exchange Street that overlooks the high school. And after George, his son Earl took over the farm, and his wife was Bertha, and they continued farming until Earl died, and then Bertha died in 1990, and that's when the farmland was subdivided and the housing development went in there. So Siegel Cove Road for a long, long time was the farmstead of the Siegel Cove family. And the original house was built in 1865, but it was torn down in 1945 and a smaller house was put up. And on the farm, around the farmhouse, they planted a lot of maple trees, and for a long time it was called the Maple Lawn Farm. And there's also a Siegel Cove Park in that area named after the road and the Siegel Cove family. And the Albium Road, named after Ole and Christina Albium. And they were both born in Norway and immigrated here with their parents. And Ole and Christina had a farm east of AB, but what is now Albium Road. And then after a short while, they moved about a quarter mile west, still on Albium Road, and built their farm. And Albium Road actually went through their farm. They had acreage on both sides of the road, and their barns were on the south side of the road, and their house and some other outbuildings were on the north side of Albium Road. And I think it was just called Albium Road because, just like these other places, it went by or through their farms, and it was just known around the community. Just head out on Albium Road, and everybody knew where that was. And so eventually it officially became that name. And the Albiums had four children: Elmer, Oswald, Lydia, and Conrad. And everybody knows Conrad Albium. Elmer is the child that took over the homestead after Ole died. And Elmer also went to the University of Wisconsin, got his degree, just like Conrad, but Elmer was the oldest son, and he felt that he wanted to actually farm, so he came back to farm. And Elmer married Bessie, who was a McConnell, and they had one child, Lorraine, and she married Willard Egner, and we'll talk about them later. But Elmer was also, besides a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, he was on the Dane County Board and the Dane County Parks Commission, and he was the chairman of the town of Dunn, and also on the McFarland School Board. Elmer's wife, Bessie, died in 1940, so he remarried 10 years later to Constance Barham, and some of you know her as Mrs. Albium, who was a grade school teacher in McFarland and McFarland's first kindergarten teacher in the 1950s. And Holscher Road. This is one street that's probably changed the most besides Siegel Cove. But this picture is taken probably from the intersection of MN or Broadhead and Holscher looking north. And if you had taken that shot 15 years ago, it would look totally different. It was a very rustic rural road at that time. But now it looks quite different. Named after the Holscher family, Frederick and Maria Holscher came from Germany with 10 kids. And their oldest child was a Christian Frederick. And I couldn't really trace it, but Frederick and Maria didn't stay long. And a lot of their kids went with them to Nebraska. And that's where most of them are buried. But Christian Frederick stayed and farmed. And their farmland stretched from Holscher Road all the way west to Marsh Road. There's quite a large swath of farmland there. And Christian had 4 kids, Clara, John, Albert, and August. And it was John Holscher who stayed on the farm and continued farming there. But August became a big-time banker in Madison, and he was actually one of the founders of the bank in Madison. And August was a charter member of Lutheran Memorial Church on campus. And a lot of the Holschers went to that church, and I was curious why they went to Lutheran Memorial. That was quite the hike to go to church when there's a Lutheran church down the road, a quarter mile. But the Holschers came from Germany, and the Lutheran church, a quarter mile down the road, all the services were in Norwegian. So, can't blame them for finding another church. And then John Holscher, who was on McFarland School Board at a time, in 1918 when they opened the new grade school in 1918, he was on the school board. And he had 4 kids, and one was Maud Holscher. And if you grew up here in the 50s and 60s or early 70s, you knew Maud as the woman who caught the noon passenger train to Madison every single day and took it back home. She was the original bag lady. She carried 2 shopping bags with her every day. She was a University of Wisconsin graduate. And she went to campus, I think, almost every day that she took the train. So an interesting character. Sher and Johnson Streets, named after Sher Johnson, who was the farmer on that property. And so he was born in Norway and immigrated to Dane County in 1856, and lived in Stoughton for a brief time, and then settled in the town of Blooming Grove, where he was a farmhand. And during the winters, he would go up north and work in the pine forest. In 1861, he married Bertha, or Betsy Anderson, and she also immigrated from Norway. And they had a number of children, Lena, John, Mary, Christina, Serena, and Ellen. Ellen was youngest, but she was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and was a school principal in Waukesha County. And John, or as he went by J.S., was a longtime store operator in McFarland at the J.S. Johnson store, which is right on this very spot that we're standing. For 40 years or more, J.S. Johnson operated the store there and was also postmaster for many years. But Sher Johnson purchased the farmland in 1864, 1865, and it stretched from Bashford Street, Creamery Road, all the way to Mud Lake, and east of Exchange Street, where all those houses are on the east side of Exchange Street. That was the Johnson farmland, and so Sher Johnson sold a lot of those lots along Exchange Street in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, and it was known as the Sher Johnson edition. And he was also a member of the town board and town treasurer, and he at times worked for the Wisconsin State Legislature, probably during the winter months, the non-farming months. And he was the treasurer for the McFarland Lutheran Church for nearly 20 years, and he helped build the first 3 McFarland Lutheran churches. The first one in 1867, the second one in 1881 after the first one blew down in a windstorm, and the third one in 1896 after the second one burned down. And this photo, that's the Johnson farmstead built around 1875. Sher Johnson was a carpenter, and it said that he probably helped build the Larson house as well. So he probably built his own house. This is the farm right after it was sold in around 1976, 1977. And I doubt if that was Sher Johnson's barn, but after Sher Johnson, it was owned by Chris Johnson, I don't think Chris and Sure were related, but then after Chris, it was Carol Johnson, who was Chris's son. And you can see Johnson Street being excavated here right in front of the barn. This is the silo where the house sits on top of the silo over on the corner of Dennis and Exchange Street. And then Daly Road, another street that's mispronounced by newer people. It looks like Dale, of course, but they pronounced it Daly. And I'm sure the original Dailies, the ones who came over from Norway, pronounced it Dala, but that was too difficult for non-Norwegians, so they said Daly. But it's Carl Daly and Agate. And they both immigrated from Norway at different times, but they married in Stoughton in 1885. And sometime between 1881 and 1890, Carl bought farmland. And so this is another interesting thing. You got Daly Street up here and Daly Street down there. They don't connect. And I don't know why they never did connect them. But his farm was up here. The housing was up in the barn and whatnot up here. And they owned land all the way to the lake. And for a time, all the way past Farwell Street down to Burma Road, before there was a Farwell Street here. And then little by little, they kept selling land, so it just shrunk a little bit. And they had 5 children, Tilla, Kittle, Anna, Emma, and Gerhard. And Gerhard was born in 1901, and he's the one who took over the farm after Carl died. And Emma hung around for a while she was still single and helped Gerhard farm. But then Gerhard married Hannah Wilkins in 1942, and Hannah was born in Black Earth or Vermont Township. And she was a rural teacher, and she taught for many years. But her mother was from McFarland, so she was here. So she, here to visit relatives. But she met Gerhard at that time, so they were married. And Emma, the sister, married Leslie Egner, and they had another farm elsewhere in McFarland. But Gerhard and Hannah, over the years, kept selling parts of their farm off. And Gerhard died, and then Hannah sold the remaining 35 acres to TNT Technology in 1970. And at that time, the Daly house and outbuildings were demolished and replaced by the TNT Technology building. And that's now Amtelco, right behind Pick and Save. And so the village board agreed in 1985 to change the name Daly Street to Curtin Drive. And the Amtelco people, their son was Joseph Curtin, and he died shortly before the Amtelco people opened up their business. And so they wanted the street name to Curtin Drive in honor of their son. But Anna Daly, who was still living, showed up to the village board once she heard about the name change, and she had a petition with 250 signatures, and there were a number of people, a dozen or so people with her at the village board meeting, and they protested the name change. And so the village board relented and said, okay, we didn't realize we were doing something we shouldn't have. We should have contacted you, but so we'll change it back to Daly Street. And they had a compromise where they, on the street sign, they said Daly Curtin, because part of it is Daly Street, and then the upper part, past Pick and Save, is Curtin Drive. And so that was acceptable. And then there's Bisbee's Daly Center, the little shopping center on the 51 and the Daly Road corner, and named after Hannah. And Hannah was, of course, the top lefse maker in the whole village. And descriptive names, a lot of streets are named after whatever's next to them or whatnot. And you got Main Street. Every place has a Main Street, but there are three here that I'll just talk about. The Hidden Farm Road. And of course, it's named Hidden Farm because you can't see the farm from Elgin Road. And even when you come up over the hill there, you can't see it until you make a couple turns. And so that was the farmstead for Ole and Ragnhild Skari. And they both, of course, came from Norway, like most of the farmers around here, except the Sigelkos and the Holschers were the few Germans that were here. They were married at West Koshkanan Church in 1966, and they made their home and raised their children on the farm. And it's now Hidden Farm Road. And they had 12 children, and 4 of them died in infancy, but 9 of their 12 children were born in the log cabin that now stands behind the McFarland Museum, which is the cabin up there. And their son, Albert Skari, took over the farm after the parents died, and he enjoyed collecting old things. He grew up seeing all these tools and equipment that was being used by his parents and then all their Norwegian friends. So he collected them and he saw them for sale at an auction or whatnot, and he just stuffed the cabin full of these artifacts, because in the late 1890s they moved out of the cabin and built a nice house. But so he had this cabin, and there was a second cabin on that property that he stuffed both of them full of these old implements and tools. And so when Albert died in 1967, his collection of over 1,100 items was given to the McFarland Historical Society, which basically was the impetus to the Historical Society to build a museum. And so the vast majority of their collection is from the Albert Skari artifacts. And Creamery Road, named after the creamery that was there. McFarland Creamery started in 1891, and it was known as the Edgerton Creamery Company at that time. And so the farmers would either haul their milk to the creamery, or somebody was hired by the creamery to go out and get the milk. And for the first 50 years, the dairy went through a dozen owners or so. And it was in 1944 is when the Ryder, William Ryder family began, and they ran it until 1974 when they closed it. And the creamery building stands today near the Melbourne school entrance on the off of Creamery Road. In Terminal Drive, this aerial photo is from the 1950s, but it's before Highway 51 was built around it. And you can see some of these darker tanks, and they just hadn't been painted yet. They're fairly new. And the first tank, and the tank farms, was built in 1954. And so once the Highway 51 bypass was constructed, they renamed, because Highway 51 at one time went along this blue route, and this is Terminal Drive now. And so the bypass went to the east, and then when the bypass was put in, they renamed 51 over here Terminal Drive. And that was in the late 1950s. And it's named terminal because that's the definition of an installation where oil or gas is stored at the end of a pipeline. And then post-war growth. And so I showed that aerial photo a little while ago showing McFarland 1930, and it stayed that way until the mid-1950s. There was very little growth in the first 100 years in McFarland. And so there weren't any new streets until about 1955. You had Renee Court and Lewis Lane and then Lanning Lane and a couple of years later in the late 1950s. And they're down here, Renee Court, and Lanning Lane, and Lewis Lane, and then Lanning Lane, just one block. And this was the first new housing development in McFarland. New houses built along Exchange Street, and then of course Renee Court and Lanning Lane. And I grew up in Renee Court, but I was always told that Renee and Lanny were the names of the Lewis family, but I couldn't figure it out. And then I found this wedding announcement of Lynn Lewis, but her middle name is Renee. And so that's where Renee Court comes from. And she was the daughter of Helmer Lewis, who grew up on that farm. And Lanny, I don't know where that name come from. Her sister is Luann Lewis. Maybe Luann's middle name is Lanny, but I couldn't figure that out. Or maybe Lanny is just a nickname, family nickname. But that's Renee Court and Lanny Lane and Lewis, of course, after the Lewis family. But I'll talk about the Lewis family later. But this is just an interesting photo. I had to throw it in because this is the intersection of Renee Court here and then Lewis Lane. And then down here, Lanny Lane turns left. This is probably very, very early 1960s. And shortly after that, a few years after this, Renee Court continues across Lewis Lane and then curves down as Lanning Lane continues to the right, and they meet up. And then eventually Lanning Lane just keeps being added onto and going further to the south. And Lower Mud Lake in the background. This is circa 1976. I know for sure it's not 76. It has to be 77 or 78. But you can see there's been a little more growth. This is Creamery Road coming down here and then catching Albion Road. So this is where Country Wood would eventually be. And this is Elvin and Luann streets, and you can see Lanning Lane has stretched further to the south, and Highland Street, and this is Lewis coming down here. They haven't developed much of Lewis Park yet, and so it's growing. This is Valley Drive. That's not there yet. And Seagull Road would be right here. And so a lot of names of the new streets were named after the first names of people like Renee or Lanny. Leanne is the granddaughter of the developer of that area. Ben Petty was the developer. He was a developer from Stoughton. And Scott Street is a grandson of Ben Petty's. And Elbin Avenue, I couldn't figure out where Elbin Avenue came from. But Ben Petty's wife's first name was Alice. So we have Alice and Ben put together. And then Norma Road is named after Norma Larson Henneke. She was a daughter of John and Julia Larson, the owners of Larson's Beach. And Norma Henneke, I think it was her grandson who had the Larson house that was eventually sold to the McFarland Historical Society. Meredith Way, Brendan Circle, and Aaron Lane, just off of Lower Exchange Street. And I just want to, let's see. Yeah. And so Lois, let's see, Meredith Way, Aaron, and Brendan, those are all children of E. David Locke, who the library is named after. And so we have Uehara Street here and Larson Drive here on the map, but you won't find either one today because they were replaced by Aaron Way, or is it Aaron Way or Meredith? Aaron Lane took over Larson Drive. Uehara Street was Meredith Way, and they came down and hooked up to Sleepy Hollow. And Brendan Court is just a little cul-de-sac that's up at the top. And so for some reason, the village board felt it was important to rename a street named after Larson. I was a little perturbed by that. But I figure, you can't have enough streets named after Larson, but the village board thought they should do that. Since there's a Larson Street in Edwards Park, they felt they didn't need a Larson Drive. And there's a Uehara Drive up here, and they didn't need a Uehara Street. To eliminate confusion, they changed them. And there were other instances of possible name changes over the years. Back in 1967, again, Daly Street, they were thinking of changing it to Bayview Drive. North Main Street, from Amy Street up to Marsh Road, they were thinking of naming it Meadow Way. And Lake Edge Bremer Road, they were thinking of changing it to Sunset Bay Drive. And South Court, they were thinking of changing that to Waubesa Street. But for some reason, all the changes were denied. And so these are the only two. Of course, that would be a Larson Drive. It's the only one of the only ones that they had to change. But the first name I want to focus on is Dennis Drive. And it goes from Johnson Street down to Marsh Woods Drive. And Dennis Chamberlain is the man the street is named after. He was born in 1949, and his parents divorced, but his mother remarried to Carol Johnson, the farmer on the Johnson farm. And so Dennis spent a lot of his childhood on that farm. And but his mother divorced Carol Johnson around 1965, at which time she and Dennis moved to Elkhorn. And he continued high school there, graduating in 1967. But he was drafted and entered the Vietnam War, and shortly after that. And he was in the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Division, the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. And he was stationed at Tai Ninh, and it was northwest of Saigon, about 55 miles, not far from the Cambodian border. In April of 1970, the base was used as a staging area for the U.S. units participating in the Cambodian campaign. And the base was often a target for numerous mortar attacks by the Viet Cong because of that. And on June 26, 1970, one attack occurred with mortar and rocket fire, killing Dennis. And so when Carol Johnson, even though he was divorced from Esther and hadn't been around Dennis for 6 years or so, but when Carol Johnson sold the farm, he had one condition, that the developers name one street after Dennis. And so McFarland keeps growing. You can see Country Road now down in the corner, and Valley Drive is over here with all the side streets and more streets coming up on the northeast side of town. And so things are changing, and there are more and more streets. And then, so with so many streets, you kind of run out of names. So the developers are the ones in charge of naming the streets. And so it was interesting to find out that there are 10 streets named after birds or animals in the new subdivisions, Pheasant Run, Fox Run, Morning Dove Drive, and so on. There are about 25 streets named after trees and flowers. And there are close to 40 names that are just simply idyllic sounding. Dream Lane, Red Barn Run, Open Meadow Spring, and so on. And quite surprisingly, there are over 10 streets named after state parks or trails, such as Rocky Arbor, Devil's Lake, Tuscobia, and Wheelwash Way. And when I saw Tuscobia and Wheelwash in a new subdevelopment going east of Holshire, I thought, oh, those have to be named after Native Americans. And so I was looking and I couldn't figure it out, but Wheelwash is a state trail, and it's named after the first two letters of the 4 counties that it runs through. And I'm thinking, what's the connection to McFarland with that? I don't think there is any. And it goes through Winnebago, Outagamie, Waupaca, and Shawano. And Tuscobia is a state trail way up in the northwest part of Wisconsin in Barron County. And it might be an Indian name, but the origin is fuzzy, but there's no local connection to it at all. And so the street names are proposed by the developer, and oftentimes they have quite the imagination, it sounds like. And the Village Plan Commission then okays it, and then it's passed on to the village board, who rubber stamps that there are very few objections to street names. And but I'm thinking maybe the Landmarks Commission should get involved in that process and decide names. I would think at least every development should have at least one locally historic name attached to it, or a Native American name attached to it. And speaking of which, there are only 2 streets in McFarland named after Native Americans. White Horse Place, which is actually a private street, and so it doesn't have an official standing with the village. And Sauk, which the Sauk tribe was really not involved in the McFarland area. But I'll just quickly go through these names. Bremer Road, named after Paul Bremer, who must have lived up in that area, but he was the first barber to operate out of that little barber shop on Main Street in the 1940s and 1950s. Osborne Drive, developer Eugene Osborne and his sons Gene and Dwayne, they created Osborne Estates that built a lot of houses there, and they thought they should name a street after themselves. And I always thought it was after a farm. There was an Osborne farm along MN, but that was on the plat map. It was Mrs. Osborne, and she spelled her name with an E, and the developers did not have an E in their name, so it's named after the developers. Gene Osborne, who was a lifelong resident of Madison, and just happened to own a lot of farms in the Madison area and developed them. Paulson Road is named after George and Crystal. They moved to their farm in 1946, and they moved away in 1985. It was basically a gentleman farmer's type of farm. He worked for 40 years for the Forest Products Laboratory, but had this little farmette that he liked. But both were devoted to and active members of the McFarland Lutheran Church. And Crystal was my first grade Sunday school teacher. And Severson Street, named after Olaf Severson. He ran the Elm Grove Hotel, which was located behind what is now the maple tree. He was a village trustee in the 1950s, and he was the president of the East Side Businessmen's Association, and he had a gas station on Atwood Avenue for a while. Smith Ridge Court, named after Jeannie and Vernon Smith. They also had a small farm or farmette off of Holsher Road. She was a costume designer at the Madison Repertory Theater and was a founding member of the Madison Theater Guild. And she also was heavily involved in the 1960s, early 70s with the McFarland Academy D one-act play productions, and she's making all of the costumes. And for McFarland, that was a big deal because all of the one-act plays involved 80 to 100 students, and they all had costumes made by Jeannie Smith. And she was the assistant costume designer for the film The Immigrants, which was filmed in Wisconsin. Schneider Place, named after Lloyd and Daphne. I'll talk about Lloyd later. But the two names I want to focus on are the White Horse Place, and then later Olson Court. But White Horse Place, named after Walter Whitehorse. He built a house on 5 acres that he owned between Highway 51 and Terminal Drive, just on the north side of Sequoia. His mother was Annie Greencrow Whitehorse, and the Schenck Middle School was renamed after Annie Greencrow Whitehorse, Walter's mother. Walter's father was Ralph Rubin, who was an immigrant from Odessa, Ukraine, back in the late, maybe after World War I. And Rubin was kind of a traveling salesman. He'd go from town to town, but he would travel by train, and so he would hop on freight trains. And one time he tried to hop on, and he slipped, and he fell, and he lost both legs. But Annie met Ralph after the accident, but they got married, and they had a number of children. But the two of them would go town to town selling things. She would dress up in her native outfit and sell, the woven baskets and beads and whatnot that her group would make in the wintertime, and Ralph would sell elixirs and self-help medicines. And they would come to McFarland back in the 1930s to the Saturday night doings, and they would have their sales. And Ralph would be on a board with rollers on it, but they made their living that way. And they were up in Wittenberg with other members of the Ho-Chunk tribe, and they would make their baskets and whatnot up there and then sell them during the summer. Walter's brother was Harry Whitehorse, which some of you might know that's a familiar name. He was quite the amazing artist in the Madison area, quite well known, internationally known. And when Walter and Harry were young, then, as I said, the family lived in Wittenberg. And the boys were sent to the Indian boarding school in Toma, an example of the forced assimilation of Native children into American white culture. But they only did that for a few years, and the family moved down to the Madison area to Monona around 1932. They had a house along where the old Beltline is, and the boys then went to Nichols School. And Walter served in the Navy as a radar man on a destroyer during World War II. And the family started Chief Auto Body and Repair beginning in 1946, which is along the Beltline. Olson Court. I am going way too slow. But I'll try to speed it up. I have the abbreviated version. But this is Sure Olson and his wife Carrie, and they had 7 children. 3 of the children stayed on the farm, Hannah, Benjamin, and Marie. And again, Sure and Carrie were Norwegian immigrants. And Sure was a tailor, and he would, in Norway, he started as a tailor. When he came to this country, he continued to be a tailor, and he'd go to the homes and go to the farms and measure people and make the clothing. But then he started farming, and their house is on Main Street. And Olson Court can be seen behind. This is a house on Olson Court. It's probably in the late 70s, early 80s. But Benjamin took over the farming after Scher's death. And Benjamin was also a village trustee and was elected president of the village in 1924. And Marie started working for the McFarland State Bank in 1918, and she was a director of the bank through the 1960s. And she was also one of the telephone operators. And then McFarland just keeps growing. And we'll go to the parks and conservancies. Indian Mound Conservancy, it's pretty obvious why that's named Indian Mound Conservancy, because of all the effigy mounds there. And of course, then on either side, there's Indian Mound Road on the west side of the Conservancy, and then Indian Mound Middle School on the east side. So that's an obvious one. In Edwards Park, named after E.N. Edwards. And so in 1899, with the help of John Larson, E.N. bought the land along Lake Wabisa, and this is Edwards Park. And then John Larson also bought land down this way, Larson Beach Road. And then Idlewild is another neighborhood between the two. But Edwards Park, they bought the land for $3,000, and Ian Edwards divided his portion of the land into 52 lots and began selling his lots for $500. And by 1905, he had sold 43 of the lots. And he built the Edwards Park store up in the upper right. And then in 1914, all of his lots must have been sold, and so he did what he had set out to do, and he sold the store to Lewis Harrison in 1914. And Ian Edwards, along with Theo Edwards, started their farm implement business on Bashford Street in the early to mid 1890s. And Ian built his home shortly after that in 1898, just down from their business, which we now know as the Larson House, or the Edwards Larson House. And he sold that in 1901, and he built another house down Exchange Street, the large Queen Anne with the turret overlooking the high school. And after a few years, he sold that to Frank Siegel Co. And by this time, Ian was involved in retail business. He had a fur store, the Ian Edwards Fur Company, and his son Maurice helped him with that starting in 1911. And he operated his business, which was located on the Capitol Square, until 1941. And Brand Park in Edwards Park. And so for the newcomers or people who aren't from McFarland, get confused by this, because why is Brand Park in Edwards Park? Well, Edwards Park isn't a park, it's a neighborhood, it was a resort. And so Edwards Park was just created in that neighborhood. And so Edwards Park goes back really a ways. As I mentioned, Ian sold the Edwards Park store to Lewis Harrison. And Lewis Harrison's son, Oscar, eventually took it over. And Oscar had a couple daughters, and they both married Brants. And they, at different times, they owned the Edwards Park store and the various businesses that went with it. In 1942, Florence, one of the daughters of Oscar, and her husband, Wilfred, ran the operation. And they were both involved in the East Wabisa Advancement Association. And that was a group that did many events in Edwards Park, and they raised funds, and they wanted to install a playground. And in 1946, Florence and Wilfred offered some of their land across the tracks from the Edwards store to the association to be used for the new playground. And then after that, the land was donated to the town of Blooming Grove, because at that time, Edwards Park area was in Blooming Grove, not in McFarland. But unfortunately, Wilfred died in 1953, drowning in Lake Wabisa after a boating accident. And so a plaque was installed in 1954 in honor of Wilfrid, naming it the Wilfrid Brandt Park. And in 1955, Bitterus Park was annexed to the village of McFarland, officially becoming McFarland's first park. And Babcock Park and Conservancy, where that is on 51, named after Stephen Babcock, the famous scientist, dairy scientist, and agricultural chemist at the University of Wisconsin. And I guess to make things short, I'll just say that in the early days, it was known as the Wabisa Locks. And then the name was changed in the 1949. There was a contest with school kids to name 3 different parks. And one was the Wabisa Locks that they changed to Babcock Park. Wabisa Beach across the lake was changed to Goodland Park. And the park on Lake Eganza was named La Follette Park. And Arnold Larson Park, named after Arnold Larson, who had his business there. He started it in 1929 when he bought a little gas station that was on the corner of Exchange and Farwell. He grew up in Utica on a farm, but I think due to his health, he couldn't farm, so he went into business. And once there, it just grew and grew until that entire block was his business, Badger Petroleum. And he owned it until 1965. But at its peak, Arnold had a network of 50 gas stations across south central Wisconsin, along with 10 bulk oil plants. And he also had 5 restaurants. And one was in McFarland called the Badger Restaurant, where Angelo's sits today. And his wife, Ruby, worked with him side by side with the business. Egner Park, named after Willard and Lorraine Egner. They farmed the land east of Creamery Road, north of Elgin Road, what is now Country Wood. And that's a photo of the Egner farm looking in the distance from close to Lower Mud Lake. But Willard was one of the first bus drivers in the McFarland school system back in the early 1950s. He was driver for 27 years, but he was also on the village board for a few years in the 1960s. And Lorraine was very involved in the McFarland Lutheran Church and the Ladies' Aids in the circle. And she was the daughter of Elmer and Bessie Elgin. In Yeager Park, named in honor of Conrad and Ruth Yeager, who lived at the end of Yeager Road along the O'Hara River. They were active, very active in conservation and environmental issues. And they received the Stewardship Award in 1986 from the town of Dunn and were very instrumental in establishing the Indian Mound Park in McFarland. Conrad was an engineer with the WIBA radio, while Ruth was a registered nurse and was the public health officer in McFarland during the 1940s and 50s. And they were both very involved in the McFarland Historical Society, and Conrad was a volunteer firefighter. In Lewis Park, village purchased the land in 1972 from Helmer Lewis, who was the son of Taloth. And Helmer was also the brother of Theodore. Theodore was a lawyer and became a justice on the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. But Taloth Lewis farmed this area, but he was mostly interested in being a businessman, so he started a business, which I'll talk about in a little bit. He was an undertaker and a furniture maker and seller and a barber. But as I mentioned, his son Theodore was a Supreme Court justice, but unfortunately he was appointed by the governor, but unfortunately he died before he heard a single case. But Helmer was no slouch either. He received his law degree from the University of Wisconsin and served as city attorney for Boscoville, and was a district attorney for Grant County and the mayor of Boscoville, and he also served as state senator in the 40s. But for 20 years, he was on the legal staff of the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. but he moved to Florida, but would continue to come up during his retirement in the summer to spend time on the family farm. But he was the one who sold the land eventually to the developers and to the village. In McDaniel Park, the village purchased the 9 acres on Lake Wabisa from James and Evelyn McDaniel in 1977. The total cost was $48,000, with half of it being paid by the DNR, so it was a pretty good deal for the village. James McDaniel worked at the Madison Post Office for over 30 years, and he was the chief personnel director. And he moved back to his native Alabama when they retired. And at the time the village purchased it, it was the 4th park in McFarland after Brant, Lewis, and Indian Mound. Then Orchard Hill Park, named for the Schutz Orchard. In 1961, Leslie and Reva Schutz started their orchard business on 13 acres, and they produced up to 3,000 bushels of apples a year. And it became a favorite for the school kids to go visit. And the Schutz sold their land to the village in 2005, and the disc golf course was put in operation just a couple years ago. And the Thrune Conservancy, named after Emil and Francis Thrune, whose farm stretched from the marshland all the way to Farwell Street. And the Thrunes sold a portion of their farmland to the school district in 1961, which would become the site of the high school. In 1969, after Emil died, Francis sold the southern 24 acres to the school district, which became the Indian Mound Middle School and the school forest. And the marshland was purchased by developer Richard Gannon. In 1973, he deeded the land to the village as part of the agreement between developers and the village to create parkland whenever there was a residential development. In Urso Park, named after John Urso Sr., a longtime resident and businessman in the area. He was the owner and operator of the Colonial Cub restaurant. Some of you might have been there on Monona Drive before it was Angelo's. And they sold it in 1969. And he was also the owner of the Capital C Tree Experts. And they owned the land and house of the Ole Elvium family, purchasing the land in the 1960s. John Urso died in 1984, and his wife and partner in business, Elaine, died in 2002. And then after her death, the village acquired 40 acres from Johnny and Elaine's grandsons. And being a dog park is fitting, as John Urso loved dogs and trained German short-haired dogs on the property. And Wacha Etcha in Rockford Heights. We might not know of these names anymore, but this was again another resort area in the 1920s, 1930s. And Wacha Etcha means my home. And then Rockford Heights, it was named that because of Mr. Zayak's plat. That was William Zayak. He was a millionaire from Rockford, but he'd come up to McFarland, Lake Wabisa every summer. And he had the Rockford knitting mill, and he had another one in Portage. And in 1930, Zayak and Obed Larson, the son of John Larson of Larson's Beach, they worked on a project to dredge lagoons. So Zayak and Obed dredged the lagoon, connecting the Air River to Wabisa up here, and then the lagoon that goes over along Severson Street. They did that because they wanted to have more lots and more cottages on waterfront. And so they had, in 1930, they had the lagoon dredged and made it navigable by boat. But if you go there today and look at it from Lake Edge Street, you'll see that you can't even get a kayak through there. The water's so shallow or full of stuff. And buildings will be very fast with this because you probably know a lot of this. Local landmarks. I'll just quickly say that there are 19 historic local landmarks or designated local landmarks by the village, the Landmarks Commission. And the 4 old buildings downtown, the J. Edward Reed Building, which a lot of us know as the Larry Pharmacy from the 1950s and 60s, Evans Store and Hall, it's the McFarland Tavern, and the Tollett Lewis Building, which is the Lofgren Dentist Building, and the Ole S. Olson Building, that you might know as the Antique Store. But all of these older properties are named after the original owner or the builder. And there are 19 historic properties in town. Based off of a walking tour, we did a booklet that had 60 historic properties listed. And I know what you're saying. I hope he talks about all 60 properties. But anyway, but the interesting thing is this spring or summer, an official plaque is going to be put up in front of the 19 historic properties that are designated landmarks. And one is the old Wabisa School on Sigilco. But the ones on Exchange Street won't be put in this year because of construction, but they'll hopefully be put in next year. And then there's the old Wabisa School and Wabisa Intermediate School, of course named after Lake Wabisa. And the Larson House, named after John and Julia Larson, who started Larson's Beach. And now the Larson's Beach Resort is gone, and the Wabisa Shores condominiums have taken its place. Edwards Foy American Legion, of course named after 2 men that were killed in war. Alvin Edwards was killed during World War I, just weeks before the armistice, and Stephen Foy in the South Pacific in World War II. And the Loy Schneider Stadium and William J. Rice Field. Loy Schneider, the longtime attorney in McFarland, he's a private attorney, but also attorney for the school district and attorney for the village. Bill Rice was a teacher, coach here for 31 years. E.D. Locke Public Library, that's where we are now. Named after E.D. Locke because he gave $600,000 to the building fund. And so he had naming rights. And so they named it after himself. In Conrad Elgin Primary School, named after, of course, Conrad Elgin, who was a famous agricultural chemist and administrator at the University of Wisconsin, was the dean of the graduate school and the president of the University of Wisconsin for 4 years until he died, literally at his desk in 1962. It doesn't exist anymore, but a lot of us who grew up here know it as Black Bridge. It looks silver because it was painted silver in the 1970s, but it was mostly black all of its years, crossing the Erie River. Anybody know this one? Not the greatest picture, but it's Benny's Hill. And if you grew up in McFarland, because we mentioned Benjamin Olson and the Olson Court and the Sure Olson Farm, Benny's Hill. Benny was the old man who lived there, but for the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the early 70s, kids would go here every winter and sled and ski on Benny's Hill. So it was a big deal.
So we're pick and savers now?
No. If you went up this way, you'd be going up Cook Street off of Main Street. If you went up over there, it'd be Church Street. So it's all, this is Main Street that's right here. And I made it.
You put a footnote in your notes that I had personal contact with the Johnson farm family. I moved to McFarland in '68 on Landing Lane, and that was all wilderness behind us back there.
Yeah.
And I had a Labrador dog that get out of my yard And he was running up there and visit Mr. Johnson's chicken coop.
Oh,
And the first time he got out there, Chief Ken Iowa of the police department called me, said, we gotta go up and talk to Mr. Johnson. Cost me $3 for 2 chickens. And so we were negotiating, the neighbors, we were gonna buy this land and run our lots all the way down to the lake. But he negotiated with McFarland and dumped us. But anyway, I had my personal contact with, my dog got out again, I let him out purposely, my kids let him out. I hid in the weeds by the chicken. And sure enough, I couldn't see him. All of a sudden I heard chickens quacking. He come running out of the chicken coop with a rooster right by the tail. He ran by me and I whopped him with a board. He never went back.
We've been here since '92, and I remember long time, well, relatively long time ago, there was an article, I believe in the Thistle, that sickle cow was, the correct pronunciation was Sigelco.
so Gilco, it could be. I always heard Sigilco.
Me too.
Mom used to say,
If you use GPS, they announce a Sigelco, Sigelco.
I knew Lyle Stickle Cow.
That's how he
He
said
was a
it.
year younger in school,
Oh, yeah,
but everybody called him Stickle Cow.
sure.
Black Bridge was Emma's Bridge.
Because Emma Egner was right there. Yeah. You related to Emma, no?
No.
But Carol Johnson, grew up next to the farm. And if you hit a ball into the field, you felt like you were taking your life into your own hands by climbing over the fence. I got yelled at him by maybe twice in my life, but it was no big deal. But as a little kid, you thought you were committing some terrible sin.
Notice that some streets change names, like Johnson on one side of, I don't know what it is, it's Bashford there, and Milwaukee on the other, and Exchange and Main Street. Why is that?
It's just a bit plattered it out now because Johnson was a latecomer. And instead of extending Milwaukee Street all the way down, they named it Johnson because after Sir Johnson, who owned that property. But that's an interesting thing. I didn't mention that Bashford Street is a little tiny street, but it intersects 5 other streets: Johnson, Creamery, Milwaukee, Exchange, and Farwell. And so, but yeah, 5 streets right in that little area. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your attention.